So Trish and I have watched a whole lot of TV over the past 20 some odd years. But I think one of our favorite shows in all of that TV watching over the last 20 something years is The West Wing. The story of President Jed Bartlett and his cabinet and staff. I think Jed Bartlett's, for many of us, is the president we think that we all deserve, and as of yet haven't gotten. But he's wonderful, and he was a brilliant man, and was a Nobel Prize winner in economics, and was always thinking, always trying to do what was right, and always thinking a few steps away, which most of the time served him well. But there was an episode we were watching recently in Trish, probably our third or fourth time through the series, where there was trouble brewing in the Middle East, and it was obvious that something needed to be done. And President Bartlett was very hesitant to do anything. And he went back and forth with his chief of staff, Leo McGarry, played by John Spencer, if you remember the show, and that actor and character. And they would get into it a lot of times. And President Bartlett was asking everyone's opinion about what they thought he should do, which was unusual for him. And finally it came down to this, a shouting match between the two, where Leo said, "You've got to do something." And President Bartlett's response was, "You can't tell me what's going to happen." And I think, as much as we dislike it, isn't that a place in life that we often find ourselves? Where nobody can tell us what's going to happen. We like our certainty, don't we? We like to know what's coming up. I know that I do, just based on my personality type. But that's not always the case. I think we've seen that played out over the past year and a half. When the pandemic started, nobody knew quite what to do. And so we responded to that crisis, and then we were told, okay, if we take the vaccine, if we mask up, then everything is going to go back to normal, is what the implication was, or at least what we believed. And for a couple of months, that was the case, wasn't it? But then there's variants. There's new things that we learn about the science, and everything is thrown into disarray again. We've been talking the past few weeks, going through Brené Brown's book, The Gifts of Imperfection. And based on her studies, she recognized that there were things that were in common with people that lived full, wholehearted lives. And one of those guideposts, the one we're looking at this week, is this: that wholehearted people are willing to let go of certainty. They're willing to embrace uncertainty, which allows them to practice two things: intuition and faith. Knowing things serves us well. It says right here in what Jenny read for us from Job 38 and verse 36 that God placed within us wisdom. Descartes recognized that he thinks, therefore I am. That's how we define ourselves as human beings. And that works most of the time until it doesn't. And Richard Rohr talks about the big six, the things that our intellect often can't engage fully: love, death, suffering, sexuality, infinity, and God. I think that we would all recognize that those are six things that it's really impossible to be certain about. And so a lot of times when we encounter things that we're not certain about, we want to gather as much information as possible. We ask people what they think, because we would rather do that and be able to find something that we were certain about instead of trusting, instead of engaging our intuition. But sometimes what we're searching for doesn't directly answer our question. I was going to tell this joke myself, but Leslie Jordan does such a better job talking about it. Leslie Jordan, during the pandemic, if you remember him from Will and Grace, he's a comedian and actor, started making little videos and sharing with people that followed him on Instagram. And this is a brief story that he shares.
One time, Mama and them, that's what we say in the South to include everybody. Mama and them. My mother and my twin sisters were driving to Florida, and they passed a town. Mother said, "Oh, isn't that sweet? Kissimmee. Sweet name for a town." My sister said, "It's an Indian name, Mother. It's Kissimmee." Mother said, "No, I think it's Kissimmee." Well, they stopped for lunch, and Mama asked the girl, said, "Where are we? How do we pronounce it?" And that girl said, "Burger King." Isn't that silly? Y'all think I made that up? You can't make this shit up.
So sometimes the information that we try to collect doesn't answer the question, doesn't engage the issue that we're facing. What Brené Brown found is that these two things, intuition and faith, enable us to live wholehearted lives. And it's wonderful the way she describes intuition. I think going back to Job 38:36, this idea that God implants in us wisdom. She says it's not just random, it just doesn't come from anywhere. It's the collection of the things that we've learned, the feelings that we've had, and the experiences that we have encountered. And that collects in our minds and in our hearts. And so when we encounter something new, that intuition, faster than we can consciously think, gives us a gut feeling in how to respond. But she says what blocks that a lot of times is our need for certainty. Our need from authority or information from the outside. And when we're always looking for that certainty, we don't often listen to what our intuition, to what our gut is saying. And then faith, which I think those of us, many of us that have grown up in the church, think faith is believing a set of certain things or gathering knowledge about God and about stories in the Bible and what we should do and what we shouldn't do. And all of that informs our faith. But if we leave it at that level, I don't believe that we ever get to the place where our faith can support us. Get to the place where our faith will support us with our engagement with these big six, with death and love and suffering and sexuality and infinity and with God. It takes being willing to trust our experience with the divine. It takes our willingness, as Van Morrison sings, to travel into the mystic. Not always a comfortable place to be when we encounter the hardships of life. The book of Job, probably, parts of it at least, one of the most ancient texts that we have in Scripture. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Because it's asking the question that we all ask at some point, why does this stuff happen? And so that's what this book is trying to engage. In some ways, so not satisfying. The beginning of the book of Job is a conversation between God and Satan. And Satan goads God into testing this person, Job, who Satan says just has it so well, of course he loves you, God. And then God allows Satan to test Job. What a horrible story. I'm sorry. But ultimately satisfying because it expresses the encounter between humanity and the divine. Between the beginning and the passage that Jenny read for us is chapter after chapter after chapter of Job trying to figure out what went wrong. By Job polling his friends. And his friends, to their credit, were willing to be with him and sit with him in the pain. Not so much to their credit, they were trying to give Job answers that fit into their certainty about God and faith, and kept saying, Job, you must have done something wrong to deserve this. What is it? Let's go back and figure it out. But Job maintained his innocence. And because of Job's perseverance, because of Job's faith and trust, he's granted audience with God, God's self. Job asks why. God responds, who are you to ask why? Did you set the seas in place? Did you create light? There is so much more to this, Job, than you could ever be certain about, that you could ever understand. And so we read that, and it's almost like God seems somewhat like a bully there talking to Job. But the result of that is one that has stood before and has engaged God, God's self, coming away with a greater understanding. And not to mess with your theology too much, but maybe God came away with an expanded understanding as well. We have the benefit of, even when we don't understand, to be able to trust. That's how this spiritual journey progresses. Came in contact again with something a few weeks ago from a man named Dallas Willard, who writes on the spiritual life, wrote a book called The Spirit of the Disciplines and the Divine Conspiracy. And this diagram is probably nothing new to us, but the way that it was presented kind of shifted my perspective. This, what Dallas Willard calls the golden triangle of spiritual growth. And so up at the top of that is the action of the Holy Spirit, as he places it, as he names it. Spirit. Top of that triangle is God, God's self, the source of all being. And I know we think we know exactly what that means, but if we ever get to that place where we think we know exactly what that means, we should go back to Job and read that for us again. And then there's the ordinary events of life, the temptations, just life itself, the things that we encounter, the sufferings that we endure that are a part of life. And then over on the other side of the corner is planned discipline to put on a new heart, as Dallas Willard call it. What we might refer to as spiritual practices. Spending time in silence. Spending time in prayer. Spending time out in the beauty of the cosmos. I mentioned this last week, but was reminded a couple weeks ago with a workshop that Trish and I were at, that our journey in life, our journey in our spiritual life is going to be stunted, if not impossible, if we don't engage in spiritual practice, and what they described as contemplative spiritual practice, of quieting ourselves, of quieting our ego and our mind that's always going, and allowing space for the movement of the divine, the movement for God in the midst of our lives, in the midst of our circumstances. And then as all three of those corners are engaged, we, as he calls it, become centered in the mind of Christ. We become more wholehearted in our lives and in our being. When I look at the news, when I hear the shouts of folks around me, we all are so certain, aren't we, about the truths that we hold and what we believe, to the point where we're willing to write someone off completely if they think or believe something different than us. That in some corners of our society and world, we're still willing to take up weapons to harm or kill those that believe differently than we do. We go through life even collecting certain, quote, certainties about God. And yet when we get to the place in our lives, usually involving those big six, often involving those big six, where those things that we've learned, those things that we're so sure of, don't serve us anymore, then we're tempted to just completely walk away from our faith, from the presence of God in our lives. What if we were willing to loosen our grip just a little bit on those certainties and to allow ourselves to sail into the mystic, to trust the movement of God in our lives in all of its varieties and expressions? Will you join me in prayer?